both for having me. Let me just take a minute to introduce myself. So we're Secure Packin. I am the manager of bereavement services at Hospice of Rockland. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I've been with Hospice for about 11 years. I work with children through adults, running various programs, one of which is our Healing Hearts program, which is our family bereavement program. So that's for children ages 4 through 18 and their parent or guardian. I also do private practice work outside of hospice, and so have been working with grieving children and grieving families for a pretty long time now. So tonight is kind of multifaceted. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about grief, right? In order to help your children, in order to help the children of the community, one of the first things that we have to do is to appropriately be able to identify what grief looks like, right? And then we're gonna talk a little bit about our own grief, how to recognize kind of where we are in the grieving process. We're going to talk about the differences between a grieving adult and a grieving child, because there are really big differences. And then we'll talk about some applicable tools that everybody can kind of utilize within their home to help their own child or children that they might come into contact with. So let's talk a little bit about grief. The fact of the matter is everybody in this room has a history with grief, right? We have all grieved, whether it be major losses throughout our life, changes, retirement, divorce, anything that creates a change in our life creates a grief response. So for better or worse, everybody in this room has had a lifetime of developing coping skills to handle that grief, right? But we all kind of have an image in our mind of what grief looks like. I tend to say it's, oftentimes a sad person sitting in the corner crying tends to be one of the images that pops into the mind of most people. But grief is really dynamic. So grief is an emotional experience, right? It is sadness. Sadness is huge. One of the other really big emotional responses of grief, and one of the responses that we often see a lot of times, especially with teenagers, is anger. So if you were to look up in the dictionary the word bereft, right? The actual literal definition of that word is to be robbed. So if we think about grief in that context, if we think about the fact that when somebody dies in our life, we feel robbed of that person, we have a right to be really angry about that, right? And so for children who might not understand that that's where the anger is coming from, you see that within their behaviors, right? You might see them acting out, you might see them really short-tempered, but for adults as well. So it's a really important aspect of grief to just keep in mind in terms of the emotional responses. Another emotional response is guilt. We see this with adults and with children. I can't even tell you how many kids I've worked with who have come in and said, I got into a fight with my dad and then he got in the car and he got in an accident and he died and it's all my fault, right? And so it's that guilt, that magical thinking that occurs. We'll talk a little bit more about magical thinking because it's really important in terms of teenage grief. Grief is a physical experience. So I often say that grief is like running a marathon, right? Your mind running a marathon every single day. But because you're not physically running a marathon, you don't associate the physical exhaustion with a grieving process, but it is. It can feel like tightness in your chest, it can feel like tightness in your stomach, it can feel like a total exhaustion of your body. We see the physical symptoms a lot of times with kids, all of a sudden headaches and stomach aches become a little bit more common. And so making the connection for them that, maybe you have a headache not because you didn't drink enough water today, but maybe it's because you're really angry. Maybe it's because you're really sad, and let's talk about that. Grief is a cognitive experience. One of the things that we hear often is, I feel like I'm going crazy, right? I can't remember anything. I can't remember appointments, I can't remember phone numbers, I have to read a sentence 6 times in order for the information to really settle in. And so if we think about that as adults, right, as a child who's sitting in a classroom, what does that look like? And we'll talk about what grief looks like in the classroom as well, but just kind of keeping that in mind. Grief is a spiritual experience. So, the people who have great faith in their beliefs is wonderful, but for a lot of times, and especially teenagers, especially the older teenagers, it becomes almost this existential crisis, right? Well, if there is a God, how could this God allow this to happen? And, I thought I believed in heaven, but now that I have to kind of visualize somebody being there, I'm not so sure if it exists anymore, right? And so there can be an anger at God, there can be a questioning at God. It is that existential crisis. So knowing yourself, knowing your own grief responses is essential to help your child. So a loss like the one that this community has just endured will create a grief response for everybody here. What it does is it stirs up grief from previous losses. So our brain kind of has this unique way, right? Our brain connects current losses with past losses. So, all of a sudden you might be thinking of mom who died 20 years ago, or maybe you yourself have lost a child, and all of a sudden that grief is kind of bubbling up to the surface for you. So knowing where you are with your grief response, with this loss, will help you to help your child. It is so important as the adult in their life to model appropriate grief behavior, right? So what often happens is, it's, I gotta dry the tears, I can't show them crying, we don't wanna get them upset, and the kid comes in and he's like, oh, I just gotta take a deep breath, I don't wanna upset mom, and everybody's trying to protect each other. What would be really helpful is if, mom or dad can show, no, I'm really sad about this and I'm crying and that's okay. Then it opens up the space for that child to say, oh wow, it is okay to cry about this. Mom's crying and she's telling me that it's okay, or dad's crying and he's telling me it's okay. This is really sad. Maybe we can cry together and maybe we can help each other to feel a little bit better. So that's just pretty much what grief looks like. So I talk about the fact that we all kind of walk around with a security bubble around us, right? We hear about all these awful things that happen in the world. We hear about awful things that happen in communities, but it's always somebody else's community. It's always somebody else's family, until it's not, right? And then that security bubble that we all walk around with is completely shattered. And then we feel really vulnerable to all those really awful things that can happen. And this is true for adults and this is true for children. So you might find, either for yourself or for the child, an obsessive need to kind of know where everybody is at all times, right? Somebody doesn't pick up the phone within the first phone calls and it's that automatic panic bubbling up to the surface. We all experience this, and this is that vulnerability that we all go through. For a child, right, for a teenager, for a young teenager, for an older teenager, they experience that also. It can look like anger, it can look like not feeling settled in their own skin even, but it's that kind of separation anxiety response that happens when our security bubble is shattered. And eventually we do kind of build that up in a new way. But especially right after something like this happens, that's what this can feel like, total vulnerability. So let's talk a little bit about how grief differs for children and teenagers versus adults. So like I said at the beginning, everybody here has developed coping skills, right? Lifetime of coping skills, for better or for worse. The fact is that children and teenagers haven't had that long of a period of time. Maybe this is their first experience with loss. Maybe this is their first experience with trauma. And so they don't have those coping skills yet to deal with this. So the body kind of goes into survival mode. So what you might find is that they look totally fine 1 minute, right? They're talking with their friends, they're playing their video games, everything seems okay, and then all of a sudden bedtime comes and it's like this big meltdown because they grieve in doses. Their body tries to protect them a little bit. Whereas we can sustain grief 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they can't always do that. So their body does try to protect them. You might even see some regressive behaviors, kind of an obsessive need for hugs or for touching can definitely be a part of it. The physical responses, the stomach aches, the headaches, the magical thinking that we spoke about before. If only I did this, maybe this wouldn't have happened. We all kind of do this. For children, it's greatly heightened. Teenagers have their own kind of grief, if you will, right? If you think about what happens as a teenager, there are losses that are naturally occurring, right? This need for independence, right? This pulling away a little bit from the family unit, maybe not necessarily needing to depend on the adult in their life as much, but still needing to, right? Kind of trying to find themselves, maybe changing friend groups, or there are natural losses that occur throughout a teenager's period of time. So that can kind of complicate a grieving process because all of a sudden it's this intense need to have to depend on the family again as opposed to trying to find that independence, right? So it just kind of complicates things a little bit further. Teenagers are known to have various emotions, right? In any given 20-minute period, a teenager can go through every emotion you can think of. This can be exacerbated through a grieving process. And so extreme highs, extreme lows, mixed in with periods of seeming totally fine. So children grieve cyclically, right? And so for a lot of these students, especially, come graduation time, you might see kind of like an upheaval in the grief for them. They grieve at big events. They might grieve during a time of birthdays. And this, pertains to this particular loss that everybody has incurred in this community, but also losses in general, right? I mean, we don't live forever, unfortunately, but we're built to grieve, right? And so each experience is something that we can survive. And so if, this is the first loss for your child, or if this is the 10th loss for your child, what you'll see is that the grief will look like this for them kind of throughout their childhood. And so you might see grieving on holidays, if you've lost somebody within your family, just kind of stirring up that grief at cyclical events. Just to make sure I didn't miss anything. So grief is a universal experience. It's something that we all go through, right? But we each grieve uniquely. So all of our grief is unique, but it all kind of falls underneath this umbrella of what we call normal grief. So what are some of the factors that influence the grieving process? And some factors for everybody to just kind of think about when they're thinking about their own child and kind of how they are approaching this grieving process. So a history of past losses, right? A child who has had multiple losses throughout their life might have a more complicated grieving process now than a child who maybe just experienced this loss, because what's happening for the child who had those 10 losses is the grief for all of those losses are bubbling up to the surface. A history of mental illness. So anybody who has a history of mental illness, a child with a history of mental illness, just kind of has to take note of what they're going through, their experiences and their reactions as it pertains to the mental illness, because it can exacerbate some of those symptoms. Relationships to the person who died. So while everybody's security bubble is shattered, the person who, talked to this young man every day is going to be more affected day to day than the person who knew them peripherally. Because, when you go to pick up that phone at night, when you're used to talking to that person, it hits you in a different way, right? Coming back to school was a really big deal for a lot of the kids. When we were here, the community here is absolutely extraordinary. There's something to be said about a smaller school community because everybody knows everybody. It really was just amazing to be here to see. We go out into schools often, unfortunately, when these things happen, and they do happen in Rockland. We've been through a lot of different districts. It was amazing to witness the level of family that was here. The fact that the staff members were all kind of checking in with each other, and the kids were all just kind of, checking in with each other, making sure everybody was okay, was really quite amazing. And so the sense of community here really is absolutely extraordinary. But being here, and for a lot of times the students coming back, and all of a sudden, we heard a lot from the students. I used to pass him, going to third period. Or, I used to sit next to him in this class, and it was that first time being in that experience, knowing that something was missing, right? That was how that grief was experienced. And it can be jarring and shocking, right? When we think about death, when we think about the finality of death, it's a huge concept for all of us to wrap our minds around, right? And then you have this 15-year-old who maybe hasn't experienced death before, and the finality that somebody is physically present one day and gone the next, and what that means and what that feels like is really intense. It's intense for adults, and it's really intense for children. I'm sure most of everybody has heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was kind of like the founder of grief education, if you will. And she came out with those 5 stages of grief, which are fantastic, and they definitely apply. But in terms of grief theory, we've kind of moved a little bit beyond that, and we talk about tasks of grief. So when we talk about grief, we talk about task number 1, accepting the reality of the loss. And when you think about that, that's huge, and that's what a lot of the students were doing that first day back, right? They came back, he wasn't there anymore. Accepting the reality that he's never going to be there anymore. What that looks like and what that feels like. The second task is accepting that feeling the feelings associated with that acceptance, right? So kind of, what does that feel like for you? What is your emotional response to that? And then it's about memorializing the person. It's about figuring out how to have an ongoing relationship with the person who died. So for a lot of times, this is a really big concept for the kids, right? It's a big concept for us too. But just because somebody physically isn't present doesn't mean relationships cease to exist. We spoke a lot with the kids about how Alton was kind, right? That was like one of the big words that we heard from everybody. And so it was, okay, so how do you then take his kindness and make sure that you pass that on? How do you continue that relationship with him through your actions? How do you adopt some of his characteristics that were really great and that everybody admired, and make sure that you're kind to everybody moving forward? And so that's what that ongoing relationship looks like. And that's a conversation that you can have at home with the students, with your children, because that's how you move forward with grief. You know, this just happened, and so it's gonna take a while to get to that space. Some signs to look out for, right? And so grief is normal. We're built to survive grief. But sometimes we need a little bit of help to get us through certain periods of time, right? We have this quote unquote normal grieving process, but we also have what we call complicated grief. If anybody's ever interested in reading up about it, Kathy Shear at Columbia University does a fantastic job explaining this. Basically, complicated grief is when grief doesn't look normal, all right? Super basic definition of it. So what does it look like when it's complicated? It looks like prolonged acute grief. So when someone first dies, we all go through this acute grieving period, right? It is intense. We sometimes don't see a way that we're ever gonna get out of that grieving space, but we do, right? And so when I'm working with clients, when I'm working with children, I look at them and I say, okay, when we first started in August, does your grief look different now than it did in August? And if they can look at me and say, yeah, it's different, then I know that they're moving. We don't use the words better or worse, because today can feel better and tomorrow can feel worse. So it's not like a good predictor in terms of how somebody's doing. We use the term different. So if you're able to look at your children and say, okay, they look different today, their grief looks different today than it did a month ago, okay, I think that we're gonna be okay here, right? So it's that acute grief period. If, you know, after a month they're still having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, still having trouble, you know, getting to school, something just to kind of look at, right? Any signs of self-destructive behavior requires professional attention. It can be something that especially teenagers do anyway, but when it comes to a grieving process, it's something that as bereavement professionals, we can help them to kind of work through. Increased risky behaviors, something to just kind of take note of. Teenagers have increased risky behaviors anyway. But when somebody is grieving, if you find that, you know, they're drinking or they're using other substances or they're doing things that, you know, with no regard to their own life, things to just kind of take note of. And that's when you reach out to professionals, whether they be school-based, outside of school, those are things to just kind of be aware of. So understanding kind of where your grief is, right? Being able to model appropriate grief behavior, understanding a bit about children's grief, about what their grief can look like, is a really good foundation in terms of helping your child through this grieving process. So what can grief look like in the classroom? We talked about your mind kind of running a marathon every single day, right? The cognitive response of grief. So in the classroom, grief can look like daydreaming, right? It can look like totally zoning out. An inability to finish homework on time, grade slipping, all of those things can be what we see in the classroom as a grief response. So at Hospice, when I'm working with the kids, we have a word that we use, right? It's called a STUG attack. So a STUG stands for sudden temporary upsurge of grief, right? So it's sudden because it seemingly comes out of nowhere, right? And adults can experience this when, you know, you're in the supermarket shopping, you see the person's favorite cereal. And in school, it can look like, you know, sitting down at the desk and all of a sudden realizing, oh my gosh, there's another student at his desk, right? And so it's sudden. It's temporary because it does pass, but it's just this total upheaval of those grief responses. So it's really important for the kids to have a safety plan when that happens, right? It can be really scary, kind of, it's like anybody who's experienced a panic attack, right? It goes from experiencing that panic attack to worrying that you're gonna have another panic attack somewhere. And so for kids, it's that same kind of a thought response. And so a safety plan can simply look like raising your hand and asking to go to the bathroom. Going to the bathroom, taking really cold water and splashing it on your face. And a couple of deep breaths, and by the time you're done with that, the stug will have passed. And you can go back to your classroom and nobody has to know that anything even happened, right? Sometimes just having that safety plan in place is enough to ease that anxiety related to it, right? And sometimes the second attacks don't happen in school, but just knowing that they know what to do if it does happen is really, really, really helpful. So again, something that you can teach your children at home. You don't need a professional for that, right? Just something you can just talk to them about what to do if, so they feel a little bit more confident. Life feels anything but normal right now for a lot of these kids and for adults as well. So creating that normalcy as much as possible, creating something that they can rely on, you know, whether you always have dinner ready at 6 o'clock at night, or, you know, you guys all sit together on a Friday night to watch a show, or whatever the normalcy kind of looks like in your home, try to keep that normalcy. Try to create some sort of a routine. They want something that they can rely on. You know, the school was awesome in the fact that they provided spaces for students to come, but they followed their normal schedule, right? They had that routine, they had that normalcy that they can rely on because the world doesn't feel normal to them right now. And being able to sit back and to say, okay, like, you know, I'm not sure how I feel, but I know in 10 minutes I have to go to math, actually is really comforting to children and to adults. And so being able to kind of create that space at home can be really helpful. Being able to kind of give choices when possible. The world feels really out of control. Grief feels really out of control. And allowing them to control little parts of their world can be really helpful as well. Even if it's as simple as, you know, do you want to take out the garbage tonight or tomorrow night? You know, it doesn't have to be monumental choices. Just some level of control that they have over their environment. You know, with little kids, we'll say, like, you know, give them the option, do they want to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt today? It doesn't have to be big. It can be simple choices that they have to create this control over their world, because the world does not feel in control right now for anybody. So one of the big things that we see from parents who are extremely well-meaning is, you know, kind of the grieve how I say attitude. Grief, no matter what it looks like right now, is normal. And the children just need to be acknowledged, and they need to be validated in their experiences and what they're feeling. We had gone to a school once, not here. We had gone to a school once, and one of the students said that they had gone into the classroom, and the teacher was like, well, you weren't even close to them, so there's no reason why you shouldn't have your homework in, right? And so as adults in the home, kind of making sure not to minimize their experience, right? Their worlds have been rocked by this, and they have a right to kind of feel and express the way that they need to. And so just normalizing that, understanding who your child is. You know, if they were a child that would sit down and kind of talk a lot, they're probably talking a lot. And if they were a child that, you know, was a little bit more introverted, they're probably very much kind of inside their own head and their own body right now. They're not going to change who they are, right? They're not going to change their personality. They're not going to change the way that they cope with life. If anything, it's going to be a little bit more exacerbated now. And so just kind of knowing what's normal for them and just kind of accepting whatever their grief responses are right now can be really helpful. You know, spending the time to listen, letting them know, you know, that you're here whenever they want to talk, you know, that you're here to listen, that you're here to talk to them, just kind of allowing for that space. You know, just so that they know. You know, they might not want to talk. The fact is, especially teenagers want to talk to each other, right? They want their friends. They want to be with their friends more. But just knowing that the adult in their life is here, you know, in case they're having a really hard moment and they just need to go and talk to mom. You know, just knowing that that space exists can be extremely helpful. So that is so in terms of the handouts, there's my card is back there. So at Hospice, whether we are able to provide kind of that therapeutic experience for a child that needs a little bit extra, or we can refer out to clinicians in the community. So I always kind of do what I call a buyer beware type of a speech. So just because somebody is a mental health counselor, a therapist, does not mean that they're trained in grief. bereavement, grief is very much a specialty area. And so if you find that your child needs a little bit more help, just make sure that who you're taking them to, they have the background of grief. So at Hospice, what we've done is we kind of have done some of that legwork for you guys. So we have a fantastic list of referrals for clinicians in the area who do specialize in grief. And so if anybody is kind of interested in getting that information, my card is back there. Feel free to call or to email me, and we'll be happy to kind of provide that for you. One other thing to just look out for is trauma, right? And so this was a very traumatic experience for all involved. Trauma and grief mimic each other very closely, but they're a little bit different. And trauma always needs to be processed through before you can get to the grief. So trauma can look like daydreaming. It can look like extremes in emotions. Whenever that happens, whenever I screen a child coming into the practice, what I always do is ask, do you have any images that pop up on their own? Not when you're thinking about it, right? Not when you're thinking about what happened, but let's say you're in class or you're watching a TV or playing a video game and all of a sudden you have an image that kind of flashes in front of your face, right? Or a sound that seemingly pops up out of nowhere. To me, that's a sign of trauma and something to look out for. Now, this just happened. So for a lot of kids, they might say, yeah, that happens to me. You know, maybe they went down to the crash night or maybe they saw it on TV. They're having these images pop up. Right now, it's actually pretty normal. In a month from now, it won't be. In a month from now, that's when we assess for trauma. So something to just kind of keep an eye on in terms of your children, in terms of who you're working with, to just make sure to assess for that trauma. And again, either whether we at Hospice can help them or we refer out, we have clinicians who do this work. So there's a pamphlet about the Healing Hearts program, just in terms of like our family bereavement program and what we do so everybody is aware of it. The When Teens Are Grieving book. So this pertains not only to loss of a friend, but it pertains to loss in general. Leave this around the house somewhere. Leave it around the house. Your teenager passes by, maybe they'll pick it up and they'll read it themselves. Or hand it to them and say, you know, I got this really great pamphlet, maybe you want to take a look. This is written mostly by teenagers for teenagers, so it's kind of in their language, and it's a way that they can kind of understand their own grief. Some applicable tools as adults in their lives, also really helpful. But I always say just kind of leave it around the house. If they're resistant to it, leave it around, eventually they'll pick it up. We have online resources for children's bereavement. So the internet, as we know, we can't always trust. These are trusted resources that we utilize. So obviously the Hospice of Rockland website, we have some information about children's grief and how to help somebody who's grieving. The Dougie Center is a fantastic resource. As adults, as a school community, they are based out of Portland, Oregon. They're kind of the founders of children's grief. They have put up tip sheets, which I printed out for everybody, this one particular tip sheet. But they have a plethora of fantastic information. And so I highly recommend just even going and just perusing the website because there's such valuable tools on there. The National Alliance for Grieving Children as well obviously has really great articles on there, things to just kind of read up on in terms of grief, in terms of grieving children and how to help. What's Your Grief is, it's one of my favorite websites. So it's basically done by grief therapists in non-technical language. So it's really easy to understand. They kind of break things down in terms of loss for children and loss for adults. So again, a really valuable resource on there to just kind of take a look at. So why don't we talk a little bit questions? Does anybody have questions or maybe anecdotes or things that they